Hi, Joe. Welcome to the Radical Therapist Podcast.
Hey, Chris, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you. I'm excited about this conversation. I got introduced to you by one of our listeners, which I really appreciate too. And you have a background in punk rock, okay, and playing in bands, and now you're a counselor, academic, teacher, professor, etc. So, I too, I grew up in the Southern California punk scene. Uh, it was very formative in my upbringing too. So I was excited to kind of have you on and kind of talk. And I still find, and some we're going to talk about it, that it's been very influential in my life and still informs my life in various ways. And having that kind of formative upbringing in the scene here, at least in Southern California, and so I'm excited to have you here and kind of maybe talk about some of these ideas. But I guess I'm wondering maybe if you could start by describing how you got involved in punk rock. And I know you've played in bands, might still play in bands, and what you're doing now.
Yeah, absolutely. First, shout out to Brendan for introducing us.
Thanks, Brendan.
So it's a pleasure to be here and talk about it. I guess to put a pin in it, for me, age 11 was when a lot of things shifted in my life. Not coincidentally, it's also when I was introduced, well, first to heavy metal, and then to punk. Um, and when I think back on it, I find it useful to kind of use an analogy of stringed instruments and like the resonant frequencies in stringed instruments. So, for the musicians who are listening, you know that if you're in a room with a guitar and you make other sounds, certain pitches will cause the guitar strings to just naturally start to vibrate. And I think there's something of a resonant frequency to our heartstrings as well. And for some of us, when we hear distorted guitars, heavy drums, screamed vocals, we start to reverberate. Things start to make sense on an intuitive felt sense level. And it is, I've said this elsewhere, it's like an instance in which external dissonance provides an experience of internal consonance. And that is a powerful experience, just, beginning and end, but also a potential doorway into change, growth, and even healing. So, that's started to be what happened for me. I got into listening to music. A few years later, I got a guitar, started my first band with some buddies, and none of us knew how to play instruments. So you can imagine, the quality of the music we produced. But punk is a low threshold entry point. We didn't have to sound good or be good in order to be a band. So there was an experience of expression, but also of empowerment. That even just being in my buddy's basement, it brought us, and so that fueled me in ways that matter. And then jumping forward, when I was in college, I was a loud rock director for my small college's radio station. I began playing in bands that it all got me hooked into my local Boston hardcore and punk scene, which, lucky for me, has a rich history of its own. So I get connected to, as far as punk and hardcore goes, a community, and that community also connected me to purpose beyond just wanting to make music. So that also, it built. And eventually I became a licensed mental health counselor. I learned about narrative therapy from a wonderful human being who's not a punk, but is a beautiful example of how one can embody it without being it. And eventually I concocted an idea for a doctoral dissertation that combined my day job and my night gig. And I studied how hardcore punk culture can be a context for what's referred to in narrative work as preferred identity development. So since then, I've continued to play in a bunch of bands. One band, we were writing an album right while I was doing my dissertation work. So I have an album that is an offshoot of my the data I collected in my dissertation. So that was pretty cool. I published a few articles related to the dissertation inquiry, and for the last 5 or so years, I've been teaching counseling and psychology as my full-time gig. Um, but I got to say, before I pause from answering your question, this is the first time in over a quarter of century that I find myself not in a permanent band. Just a couple of months ago, I stepped aside from the group I was playing bass in. And so other than a couple of fill-in shows lined up for me this summer, I'm kind of grappling with the reality that an important part of my identity is not as front and center right now as it, seemingly always has been. So um, it's a unique point in my journey at which we're meeting right now.
I was going to ask if you were still in a band at the moment. So,
Yeah.
yeah, interesting. Uh, yeah, and you reminded me. We had a little garage band too. My brother played drums. I played bass. We were the Rodents, and we would make imaginary gig flyers. We never had a gig, but it was our way of maybe, trying to materialize a gig in some way. But yeah, that's great. So you write a lot about like punk values, and
Mhm.
I guess I'm curious, what would you say are punk values, and how have they informed you as a counselor, a human, et
Mhm.
cetera? Yeah.
Mm. I think it is important to start by stating the obvious that punk values are not a monolith. And, mine are influenced by my geographic and my temporal contexts too. So basically the hyper local niche within the Boston punk and hardcore scene where I cut my teeth. Um, Also, my interpretation of the values are influenced by the elements of my intersectional identity that are unique to me. Like a lot of folks, my first rebellion was against my parents. My father was a cop, so there was a very early adoption of the sort of questioning authority piece of things in a lot of ways for me. Um, and I grew up around, and I still primarily find myself among white people who are native-born New Englanders, and oftentimes who identify as male. And that's a lot of who I've encountered in my local scene. But by contrast, when touring the Southwest, I noticed a lot of Indigenous and Latinx folks in the scene, which is not something that can be said so much about East Coast hardcore. Um, and this all matters because when looking back at what our values are, I think we do ourselves and everyone a disservice if we don't first acknowledge the people who help us enact the values. So for me, what I've gravitated towards and what I've held on to from those who have influenced me is first and foremost the DIY ethos, um, a change orientation, being action oriented and enacting the things that matter, and that's done through going to shows, organizing shows, producing zines, being in a band, protesting, doing activism, engaging in health and wellness practices, and just in general aligning one's life as best as one can with values that make sense. So um, one absent but implied sentiment in a lot of punk is that there's something wrong with the world, and that change can and should happen. So underlying all the ideas for me is the presence of, I guess, a sense of hopefulness for things yet to come. And I found this hopefulness at the core of my approach to clinical work and supervision, which I think has been born from my connection first to the scene.
Yeah. Wonderful. I guess I'm wondering if you could say how punk rock has informed I mean, you've touched on it, informed your political and social critique, and
Mm-hmm.
how does it continue to inform your view of the world?
Mm. Immediately what comes to my mind is, the dead Kennedys turned me on to a lot of geopolitical controversies, and it was an education outside of textbooks that was subversive. And not only was it an education about the specific issues that they and other bands were singing about, but an education in how to think critically, and how to give direction um, for my fury, in a way that was really helpful. And more broadly, learning about zines, punk collectives, DIY venues, all the stuff that goes into making a local scene. That helped me to, I guess, first understand and then eventually participate in ways of acting in contrast to the dominant discourses that felt unethical and oppressive. And even, for me as a kid who, I was checking off almost all the boxes on the privilege checklist, and still things just didn't sit right. And at first it was an unnamed sense of disease and disquiet. And then being able to sort of learn these lessons through engagement with the scene and with the community, um, you know, fleshed that out for me. And that's part of why when I was exposed to the narrative ideas, I experienced another one of those instances of like my heartstrings resonating.
Yeah, that's great. You're having me recall. I was in grad school and I had a teacher that we had to do a quick answer a question really quick kind of exercise in some ways, and the question I got asked was, when did you first, who was your first influence in social justice, or some sort of question like that, and my response was the Clash.
Yeah.
you know that was my, for, like you said, that was, kind of my political education at the time. So
Totally.
all right, so you've also written about that parallels exist between punk culture and narrative therapy practices, and I'm wondering if you could say more about that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think both are action oriented. What I love about narrative therapy is oftentimes it's referred to as narrative therapy and community work.
Mhm.
And David Epstein, one of the co-founders of Narrative, I recall him saying that in tough times we do projects. And not to paint it with too broad of a brushstroke, but what is a DIY punk show other than a project, a communal project that people are putting together, enacting values, enacting community, creating space, and all those things. And so there's this action-oriented community focus, um, investment in moving from thinly described internalized senses of things to thickly described intentional relationships with them. And I think going to the DIY ethos, a lot of that is questioning, commercialism, materialism, what it is to live in a society where, monetization and commoditization are central to our ways of being and understanding and engaging. Um, how many people know how to live off of the grid? How reliant are we on the systems around us? And because the answer to those questions is, the system is necessary for a lot of folks' survival at this point because we've not learned other ways, the opportunity to at least dabble in, experiment with other ways, is pretty meaningful in connecting to knowledges and expertise that maybe we even have, but have lost connection to. So there's one piece. I've also seen how both punk and narrative can utilize experiences of personalized expertise, and don't just stop at pathologizing folks. Don't just stop at ways of reducing a person's experience and reinforcing marginalization and systemic harms. There is that opportunity to be weird, and to not shrink from that. Where in the best case scenario, and I know this is not entirely true, but in the best case scenario, punk is a welcoming, diverse place. Ian Mackay, Minor Threat and Fugazi, he's called it, a creative space. And I think that in the best case scenario, the parts of punk culture that I want to stay connected with align with that, as does my experience of narrative work. Um, so those pieces, a sense of critical curiosity, and the emphasis of deconstructing problematic discourses as part of this co-creation of social constructs. um, Narrative gave me tools to more fully integrate and more constructively channel the critiques I was learning from Jello Biafra and Ian Mackay and all the rest. Um, and that for me, like I said before, is why when introduced to narrative, I felt that similar resonance with the values and the ways of being, which then I was able to integrate in my ways of working. And when one has that sort of degree of consonance between what you do and why you do it, I think not only does that um, matter in meaningful ways, but it also can be transformative.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And you know, I have many friends who continue to identify with punk culture and haven't aged out, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure you have a similar experience in your own personal experience too.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how you make sense of this, like this.
Yeah. Yeah, as I'm creeping forward into my 40s here, I'm finding myself in a shifting relationship to the question. Like I said, I'm not actively touring in the band at a moment, and you know, so when I walk by my stack of guitars and amps in my apartment, sometimes I hear them asking me if I'm going to use them again. I mean, I hope so, but this sort of period of static hibernation, it's new for me. And it's not related to my age and things like that, but I can't help but conflate uh, the fact that I'm not in a band at the moment, which was a choice of mine. I chose to step out from the band of wonderful people that I was playing with. I can't help but conflate that with this idea of aging out whenever it comes up. So I sit with this, and it is part of sort of my own exploration at the moment. But where I sit right now, playing music is only a part of what matters about punk culture and the DIY ethos. I know a lot of folks who have parlayed the skills they learned from engaging in DIY and change-oriented punk into businesses, into lifestyles, that support them doing things differently than the scripts that they were handed, or the messages they've been given as kids. And so at at the risk of creating a false binary, I also know that sometimes not aging out is akin to stagnating. I think of a band that was very influential on me. I'll refrain from naming them, but when I saw them not too long ago, the singer, his dentures fell out in the middle of a song, and he couldn't articulate his words during that moment, and he didn't have the energy to continue the powerful vocal performance, which is necessary for that style of music. And I found myself shifting quickly from being there in this moment of sort of ecstatic embodiment and singing along to all the songs I love, shifting to a sense of, oh no, feeling a sense of feeling bad for him, because he was obviously trying to fix his dentures and saw the problem, but also a sense of loss for sort of the promise implied by the music. And so so aging out can be connected to a continued embodiment of the punk ethic in ways that stand outside of just doing what's within the boundaries of music, which itself I think is somewhat antithetical to the values of punk, that you shouldn't be hemmed in by having to do the same three chord whatever guitar, bass, drums, vocals thing that you've been doing for however many decades. So but if you don't mind, I'll just share a quick aside from my own musical ventures, I'm reminded of a song from one of my old bands. And I guess for some context, there's a band from Boston that had a big influence on me called Blood for Blood. And one theme in a few Blood for Blood songs was what they sort of self-described as their wasted youth crew, a bit of a double entendre there, right? But it poetically articulated some of what made that band, what it was, special in its own way. And so anyhow, on the album that I did as an extension of my dissertation work, there was one song inspired by some of the interviews that I had done, whose lyrics posed questions around this topic of aging in and I guess aging out of the punk scene. And taking the liberty to quote myself there, the lyrics were for part of the song: "We fought nail and tooth, and along the way we learned some truth. But despite our gains, one question remains: what happens after we've wasted our youth? We're not 24 anymore, so how the fuck do you act your age? It's time we work for more and channel the rage, 'cause tattoos fade."
Nice. All right. You've been speaking a lot about DIY practices, and I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about that, how they've influenced you, your work, your identity development, and with your clients.
Yeah. For those who are listening and may not be intimately familiar, I think it's important to draw a distinction between the DIY ethos that I found in punk and the DIY that is sold to us by your local hardware store, that you can come in and redo your bathroom this weekend, do it yourself. A friend of mine from the scene, she would say, "Do it yourself, but never alone." And it's actually do it together, people have said, and the ethos there, again, it's not just that you can learn how to do something, it's that you are engaging in an activity as a statement or as an intentional choice to go against or to step outside of that which is part of the dominant discourse in ways that are not helpful, not aligned with the stuff that matters to you and the stuff that, from your experience, can make the world more of what it could and should be. So that matters because I think it's easy. The term has been co-opted. DIY means many things, and so for me, that's a bit of what it means when I reference it. So how it comes up in my work. I don't know if it's unique to me in my work, but I noticed that in the therapeutic spaces that I inhabit, there's room for dissonance and disquiet, and there's room for righteous indignation. In fact, I was in a conversation this morning. It was more of a supervision conversation than a counseling conversation. But we were talking. A counselor in training was asking for my opinions on self-care, and she's from the scene, so we both share professional and musical connections, and so we're talking. And in this conversation, we ended up noting that the discussion of self-care often falsely invites us to equate self-care solely with stress reduction. But what about the benefits of balanced but intentional stress induction, such as going to a punk show, playing aggressive music? For me, distance running is restorative, although stressful. So, we chuckled. We came to a bit of an analogy in this conversation that it kind of sums it up. The self-cleaning mode of an oven is super fucking hot. So there's room for that in my work, and I think part of the capacity for that comes from the experiences I've had with punk and DIY. There's I guess one more quick story that comes to my mind. Recently in my teaching, we do a capstone course, and It's co-taught by all the core faculty, and all the students who are graduating come. So, we had about, let's say 70 people in the room just about a week ago. And so at the end of this experience, to close it out, one of my colleagues invited me to do this exercise where basically, I invite the group to think about everything that had happened through their program, the good, the bad, the things you want to cheer for, the things that make you want to, just scream in frustration. Notice the body, notice everything. We go through this whole experience. Everyone's gathered in this tight circle. And the invitation then is to bring it all to the present, and from the bottom of your feet to the top of your head, sort of on the count of three, just let it all out in this full body scream. And, so we did that. And one of the folks came up to me afterwards, and this person's from the scene, and said, it was moving to be given permission to scream after years of screaming without permission. So what sticks with me here related to clinical work is the importance both of the integration and the dissolution of the self, which I believe punk and clinical work both invite. There's an element to both that I think has the potential to inspire transformative or transcendent packets of experience, to steal a phrase from Jeff Zeig. If you kind of going back to what I was saying about the gentleman whose dentures fell out, there's a certain physical capacity necessary to engage in hardcore punk performance. If you fake it when yelling into a mic, or if you fake it while dancing in the pit, things are likely to not go well, So punk taught me how to step forward fully into the moment, which is something that I believe can be done in the service of clients in clinical contexts. For me, that can mean, attuning to my instincts and my felt sense so that I can most fully utilize the subtleties of the interpersonal exchange, maybe increasing, the likelihood that neither of the participants in the conversation has had that particular experience before. Because if problems are at least partly defined as unhelpful patterns in a person's life, the significance of doing something, anything that's outside of the parameters of the problem, it's both disruptive to the problem saturated narrative and in support of a more creative, engaged, intentional next step. And I'm reflecting as I'm speaking here that at some point I've lost the distinction between whether I'm talking about punk or whether I'm talking about my clinical work. And I'm kind of happy that the lines have blurred there, because I think it speaks to the question that you asked.
Yeah, wonderful. All right, a couple more questions for you. You've written about song lyrics and identity formation, and I'm wondering if you could say more about how you might use song lyrics in your work.
In addition to, I guess, the low-hanging fruit of playing music in session, whether that's, listening to music and talking about the meaningful lyrics that a person brings with the songs that they bring, or, actually picking up an instrument, playing new music. I guess what stands out for me most in response to your question is the relative ease I feel with being able to spot problem saturated narratives, as well as how my experience engaging with the DIY ethos has enabled me to be more comfortable collaborating with folks on ideas that fuel the search for another way, like I was saying before, stepping outside of that which is known and familiar. To some extent, just about any conversation can start off with a tacit agreement that things don't have to be this way. But the problem sometimes is even identifying what do we mean by things is an issue. And then what do we mean by this way? And outside of that, what does that even mean? And that is I think, rather rich territory for conversation. Um, and in terms of the lyrics themselves, I think of um, Pat Flynn, the singer of what I will argue to be, hands down, all across the board, all things considered, the best hardcore band ever. And I know that that is a, a controversial statement to make. Pat Flynn sang for the band Have Heart, and Pat talks about how for him, lyric writing is cathartic. How after organizing his thoughts on paper and screaming the words, full intensity, the things that were bothering him just didn't seem to bother him as much anymore. And he talks about the power of having people screaming his words back to him with all their hearts, and that's evidence that for at least for folks like Pat, and I would say in my experience as well, writing and performing meaningful song lyrics changes you.
Mm-hmm.
So the low threshold for involvement in punk means that just about anybody can start a band and be in that position. And if not that, the DIY ethos means that there's little to no barrier between a band and an audience. And, folks are often explicitly invited to share the mic. So that provides just about anybody who walks into the room who wants it an opportunity to scream those meaningful lyrics too, and to be witnessed by a room full of people, sometimes literally held up, atop a crowd of people who are physically supporting you. So, these are stances that people take. A lot of the time, punk choruses are constructed to be easy to sing along with. And a lot of times the choruses contain important phrases that identify the intentional stances being taken by the performers. So the more we know about where we stand, the more we know about what matters to us. The more we enact what matters to us, the more we connect to who we want to be. And the more we do this in community and with those witnesses, the more we are actively engaging in the process of socially constructing our preferred identities. There's something really profound, at least to me, about being moved in these sort of ways. And for that experience of having your heartstrings vibrating and then realizing you're in a room full of people who are starting to vibrate too. There's few things that provide that space and that permission to move into such an active, fertile, creative, and cathartic space.
That's great. And I have another question for you because I know you've critiqued the scene a bit, and you said something earlier that really resonated with me about when I got into the scene. It was a really diverse, creative, all kinds of sexualities, fashion, all kinds of different stuff. And then something happened where the violence showed up. And I think I've said this in a previous video before. I grew up with a guy who ended up being a co-founder of P9, Public Enemy Number One, which was, I think, now arguably one of the largest like white supremacy skinhead gangs, and I knew him from the scene, and so he ended up being assassinated by his own gang. But so there is that critique, right? And I'm wondering, and I know you've written about it. It's some other that critique and probably others, and I'm wondering, what if you have anything to say about that, or like what happened to the scene, or some of those kind of darker aspects of the scene.
Yeah. I think first of, the fact that I'm connected to Boston, Massachusetts, and, straight edge became a big thing here, and not unlike other places, unfortunately, it was a segue to violence. So people started saying, hey, I like the idea of not giving, the alcohol corporations my money, not diluting my ability to think critically, not messing that advantage, that edge that I have. So I'm going to live a clean life. And then they said, well, if you are in my space and you're messing things up, um, I'm not going to allow that. And it turned into a violent policing of the scene. You know, stories of people who are smoking a cigarette outside a venue getting jumped, and that clearly starts to step away from this notion of making healthier, better choices for self and community. But yeah, it's an absolute reality. And while we can talk about the catharsis of dancing in the pit and all that stuff like that, I mean, ultimately people are punching and kicking, and I know I've had my fair share of injuries. And as anybody who's gone to shows, I mean, you've either been injured or you've seen injuries, and we take that sometimes as par for the course. However, while that may be a piece of a lot of punk and hardcore, I think this is where, again, in line with narrative approaches, we ask into the details. We get curious about the connections to the values and the intentions and the beliefs that undergird the actions people take. And by so doing, by shifting to that more intentional relationship, we can start to say, I support A, but B doesn't really align with what got me here. The important thing is that continued uh, engagement with the critical consciousness, not just to get into the scene and be there and great, whatever, but to be able to interrogate oneself, and whether it be the music I'm playing, the venues I'm going to, the labels I associate with, the other bands that I book shows with, the what I do allow and don't allow in this DIY squat, that's a venue, how I help to cultivate that community and for lack of a better word, police that community. Do I even, endorse a word such as that, right? All of these pieces, there are examples out there of how people have really dug into doing that work in ways that are meaningful. And so while being amongst the elements of imperfection, I think we can look to find the inspirations. And, I come back a lot of times to this visual of a circle pit. And I oftentimes ask folks to consider, a circle pit for folks who haven't been to shows. Basically, it's a group of people moving in a circular direction, where we come together connected to these ideas for at least some elements of punk and hardcore that is change oriented. Are we engaging in a circle pit just chasing our tails, or are we fomenting a revolution?
Great question. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Last question for you, Joe, and I really appreciate all of this, and thank you. A question I like to ask all my guests is, what books, films, bands, I threw that one in for you. Ideas, thinkers are capturing your attention these days?
Yeah, no, it's a beautiful question, but always a tough one because, it requires uplifting some folks over others, and necessitates remembering the names of the bands I've seen, So, so the thing that jumps to me first, I'm excited about Judith Herman has a new book coming out. It's called Truth and Repair: How Trauma Survivors Envision Justice. And the reason that this jumps out to me, it's not a narrative book. And as far as I know, Judith is not a punk in any way, shape, or form, but her story is fascinating. Back in, I think it was like 88, she proposed this notion of complex PTSD. And it was part of a revolution in the field of how we understand bad stuff happening to people. She was one of the first folks to say that it isn't just soldiers in war who can experience psychological trauma. And then just as she and her peers were kind of gaining traction in the early 90s, she tripped and fell and had like a brutal knee injury. and it resulted in the formation of nerve tumors in her knee, went undiagnosed for 25 years. So in the meantime, she went through every treatment option, no success. She was tormented by this pain. Her career was derailed. And ultimately, the doctors started, questioning, is she making it up? So she's discounted on a multiple levels here. Um, and then, as the story goes, in 2019, she's seeing a doctor for, I think it was for arthritis or something like that. And the doctor, just through conversation, happened to tell her about this new research on this thing called nerve tumors. And it kind of aligned with what she was describing. So they looked into it. She got the diagnosis. She had the tumors removed. And she got back on track, finally. So, as you likely know, complex PTSD has never made it into the DSM. It's not a diagnosis that people can get insurance reimbursement for in the United States, although the ICD-11 does acknowledge its existence. Complex PTSD starts to look at the community and cultural and historic systemic elements of trauma that the current conceptualization of post-traumatic stress disorders does not fully capture. So I sit here as she's in her 80s now, putting out this new book, just fascinated, wondering about the course of our field as it relates to supporting folks whose families and communities have been through awful stuff and who have inherited legacies of oppression and pain. How those trajectories might have been different if Judith hadn't tripped on something that she didn't see because her hands were full in 1994. you know so I'm really curious about her book, and it brings to my mind a phrase that one of my colleagues and mentors, Jared Cass, uses in his book on a person-centered approach to psychospiritual maturation. He talks about humanity's chain of pain and how a lot of our efforts, and I think in this case, Judith Herman's new book would be speaking to how to disrupt humanity's chain of pain. And I don't know, Chain of Pain kind of sounds like a hardcore band to me. So
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Okay. Well, Joe, thanks for coming on, and thanks for. I've been wanting to have a conversation like this for a long time, and I'm glad, to have you here and you making the time. So, thanks for showing up.
absolutely, my pleasure. I appreciate the opportunity to talk.